Welcome to the Legally Hers podcast. I am Pratiksha Ullal, your host, and this podcast is produced by the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. Legally Hers is a series of conversations where we explore the law not just as an abstract construct, but as something that shapes women's everyday lives. Dear listeners, in today's episode, we examine the economy through a feminist lens, unpacking the gap between how the law exists on paper and how it actually interacts with economic, social, and political realities on ground, often deepening the economic precarity of women. In this episode, we zoom in further to focus on care work, the very foundation of the Indian economy. From unpaid housework by homemakers to the essential roles played by the Anganwadi workers in education and ASHA workers in healthcare, we ask what it would truly mean to recognize this labor as the bedrock of development. Together, we will trace the long history of how women's labor has been diminished, regulated, and pushed to the margins, whether through criminalization, regulatory bans, or systemic neglect. From sex work to adal padal dancers, surrogacy to domestic care work, we explore forms of labor that remain under constant threat of regulation and erasure. In this episode, we are going to be talking about the female gaze law and the invisible economy. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Dr. Prabha Kotiswaran. Ma'am, thank you so much for giving us this time and speaking to us. Professor Dr. Prabha Kotiswaran is a professor of law and social justice at King's College London. She previously taught at SOAS. She also received her undergraduate law degree in India from the National Law School of India University, Bengaluru, and then LLM and SJD doctorate from Harvard Law School. Ma'am's main areas of interest include criminal law, transactional criminal law, feminist legal studies, and sociology of law. Ma'am, I'm very humbled and honored that you could give us this time and speak to us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yes. So, ma'am, to start off, could you please give us and our listeners a glimpse of your journey as a lawyer and an academician?
Thank you. Yes, I have pretty much been in law schools throughout my career, although I've flirted with engagements with other disciplines quite a lot, which I think has strengthened my work. But as you already said, I graduated from the National Law School of India, Bangalore, very early on. I was part of the third batch of the school and was always taught to think about the law from the perspective of social engineering. So that sense that the law could be used for social change was very deeply ingrained within us. And that helped me then pursue my master's studies at Harvard Law School, especially with an interest in critical legal studies, which had for a very long time until then talked about law as just another form of politics. So I was very curious and about this idea, which is very obvious for those of us who work in developing countries like India. But I wanted to understand what this meant from a theoretical perspective, from a feminist perspective, and what the prospects for reform were. And in between, I practiced law for a couple of years at the New York law firm of Debevoise and Plimpton and went back again to get, as you said, a PhD. And since then, I have taught at SOAS, and my interests during my dissertation, my interdisciplinary interests were more in law and anthropology. Of late, it's been more focused on law and political economy with a specific focus on gender.
That's very interesting. Thank you so much for joining us, because I think you bring us a very unique perspective. Like when you said political economy, which is exactly where we want to focus on in this episode. So, as you said regarding your research interests, I was specifically very inspired and interested to know about your idea of social reproduction. I think it's a project that you've been working on since 5 years, and this idea really intrigued me. And when I read more about it, I got more into understanding the perspectives that you've used, and which is very important for us to understand. So, ma'am, could you please give our listeners a brief about this idea of social reproduction, which you say it's fundamental to the maintenance of very life. So, ma'am, could you give our listeners a brief regarding this project?
Sure. So, social reproduction is a term used by Marxist feminists, and until very recently, until the pandemic, was somewhat marginalized even in feminist theory. Social reproduction is very simple. It's basically the idea that there's a certain amount of labor that's expended in our daily regeneration. In a certain sense, female labor, typically female labor, is required to both bear children, to rear them, to cook, clean, and care for each other. And of course, this can be often unpaid work, but it can also involve paid work. So while a lot of the second wave feminists thought about social reproduction in terms of work that's performed at the level of the household, over time and with the advent of globalization, there was a fuller articulation of the fact that reproductive labor could be performed outside the household and various other institutional sites, and that it could actually be performed for pay. So the easiest example of that is paid domestic work, which is, someone is working at your household, but actually they're getting paid for it. And through my materialist theorization of sex work as a form of reproductive labor, I also argued that sex work was a form of social reproduction, which is carried out at the site of, say, the brothel or outside in the informal economy. So the project itself is very interested in thinking about social reproduction across these various sectors of women's work, because often what feminists do is to focus on a particular form of reproductive labor. And my own sense from being a lawyer was that actually, unless you understand them in relation to each other, you will not actually get to the bottom of the most progressive forms of law reform. In other words, often a certain form of work is characterized or is regulated by one area of the law, when in fact it could be quite as easily be regulated by another area of law. So you may think of sex work as the default regulation is criminal law, but you could think of it as being regulated by labor law just as well. So the question is, what is it about these legal categories? What kinds of work are they performing in entrenching certain vulnerabilities and hierarchies within these forms of work? And how can we change or shift the categorization of this form of work? If you want to shift the characterization of this form of work, then you have to think about other forms of reproductive labor. And you can see that actually there is nothing exceptional about sex work, because obviously within the institution of marriage, women also provide sexual services within the rubric of, affectionate companionship. But actually, it is also a form of reproductive labor. So one of the key insights of the materialist feminists was to really say, well, you know, if you're allowing for women to get married so that they can take care of their economic needs, why would you then, and you're not criminalizing husbands and wives, why would you criminalize women who sell sexual services for pay? So that is basically the project. The project is to really think about a continuum of women's reproductive labor, to analyze their political economy while also understanding the role of the law in regulating these different forms of work.
When you speak about the continuum of women's labor, we also come to the point that we also see and we know that women's work, women's labor particularly, has been historically devalued, right from the unpaid housework that we see, and then women, when they came out into the open, into the public sphere and started working in terms of like what labor law terms as work. Ma'am, what do you could you trace the historical beginnings of this devaluation for our listeners?
Yeah, I think that is it's a very difficult question actually to answer, but I think one could argue that the fundamental shift occurred with the advent of capitalism and the shift from feudalism to capitalism. And that, in fact, prior to that, at the level of the household, both men and women performed work for the household. And while there might have been some task specification or specialization, really women contributed as much to work outside the home as within the home. And in fact, the idea of the household, which in Greek is called the oikos, really, the idea was, or economy, traces its origins toward oikos. And today we think of the economy as being something that's resides in the market, whereas actually the term oikos was used to refer to the household. So actually, this idea of the distinction between the home and the market, between the private and the public, between the home and society, all of these sorts of binaries are a fairly recent phenomenon. So this happens with the advent of capitalism, when there is a very sharp delineation of the work that women and men do. Men go out and work in factories, while women stay at home to take care of the children, leading to this gender division of labor. And that's when the very stark distinctions get made between the two kinds of labor, and women's work within the home becomes invisible because it is not paid for. And the person that is bringing in the money in a market economy is the man who has a job in a factory. So this demarcation of work and its value is something that is relatively recent and modern.
So, when we look at this from a social lens, I believe we can see a lot that, as you said, invisible women's labor and its actual impact on women themselves. So, it's very interesting to look at law when we come back to the question of law and how law looks at law looks at women's labor first, and then the economic realities which come up in the in law's interaction when it is actually implemented. So I think I was listening to one of your lectures and it was very enlightening for me, because I think here you spoke about the synergy between women, law, and labor. Um, so I was actually very interested on the on-ground interaction of socio-economic realities, which is actually like when we go through your work, it's pretty evident that law interacts closely with economic realities. And when we look at law from a social lens, we can see something which is invisible otherwise. So, ma'am, it would be great if you could give our listeners a brief regarding this intersectionality with a special focus on the synergy between women and law.
Okay. I think the key to trying to understand the relationship between gender, labor, political economy, and the law is how we think about each of these concepts, right? So if you have a feminist approach to each of these concepts, that does a lot of critical work. So if you think about the law, I think it would, from a feminist perspective, it would also entail looking at it from a social legal perspective, which is to not think of the law purely in terms of formal state law, but to think about the law also in terms of both state law, but also social norms or market practices, which all have a very dense relationship with each other. Because often in countries like India, there is such a high level of informality in when it comes to the legal system. There's often we often berate the fact that there is a gap between the law in the books and the law in action, as though there is a huge gap which is, just exists between what the law says and what happens in reality. Now, that is true for the most part, that you could argue that if you have a criminal law of rape, it's not as though all rapes are actually investigated and the perpetrators punished, right? So there is that gap, but in between that gap, there is much else that is going on. And so when I think about the law, I think about it in a more open fashion, in the way that social legal scholars have imagined it or had theorized it as legal pluralism, which is that there are many layers of social interactions that are governed by law-like phenomena. It could be customs, it could be usage, it could be social norms, it could be market practices. So what is interesting is to look at the interrelationship between all of these in trying to understand the relationship between gender, work, and the political economy. Just as we have a feminist approach to the law, and here we assume that the law is fundamentally, furthering the interests of patriarchy. Now, when you look at the political economy, again, if you look at it from a gendered lens, then you will be attuned to the fact that women perform many layers of invisible work, right? There is the visible work, but there is also a lot of invisible work. So if you think of the political economy from a gendered lens, then you pick up these various forms of work as well. So I think what is key is in order to understand the relationship between gender law and political economy, is to assume a feminist approach to each of these forms of theories, right? The dominant theorization of law or the dominant theorization of political economy needs to be problematized from a feminist perspective. And of course, there are other. You could also think about the political economy from a capitalist perspective to think about how the political economy is structured in a way that reinforces the interests of capitalism. And here again, we need to be cautious because I think while we can be critical and should be critical of capitalism, one should imagine that in countries like India, not, there are other forms of market formations that may not simply be, a capitalist firm. You could have many people working in the informal economy, which does ultimately reinforce the interests of capital, but the way in which it does it is very different than in the context of the West. So any kind of theorization of gender law and political economy has to be very context specific. And it's only then that you can really think about uh, their interrelationship. And I think the same goes for labor. I think once you render women's work visible, you will see that there are different conceptions of labor on the ground. So if you look at it as an ethnographer, what you think of as a crime may actually be viewed by women performing that form of labor as decent work. Uh,
Right.
so you have to be really very open to these different articulations.
Correct. When you say that a sort of law assumes the power, when we go through with our deeper discussion, we'll sort of discuss on this. But what do you think about law, and do you think law has a gaze? So, in this podcast, we are sort of trying to understand what is the legal gaze that is falling on women, and like, is that really helpful to women, or is it devaluing their work further? So in this context specific question, do you think law has a gaze, or what do you think the law's gaze is?
Yeah, but I don't think the law has a stable monolithic gaze. I think it furthers the interests of the powerful. And the powerful in every context is not just men, but it also includes, there are various dimensions of inequality in society. And the law reflects the interests of those who are have the power in a social setup. So yes, for sure, the law has a gaze. It often incorporates the gaze of the powerful. And in this context, it is a patriarchal gaze.
Correct. So when we come back to that, when you already explained the intersectionality between labor, political economy, and the law, um, do you think law has, as you said, it reflects the gaze of the powerful? Do you feel it has an economic gaze through which it sort
Yes.
of views certain groups and values their labor differently from others?
Yes, absolutely. So you could argue that it has, whether you're thinking, depends on the axis of subordination and power that you're thinking about. If you're thinking about it from the lens of caste, definitely the law has to casteist gaze. If you're thinking about it from the perspective of sexual minorities, definitely there are high levels of exclusion that are built into the law because it's servicing a heterosexual system. So yes, the law is an accumulation of these various forms of gazes that are exclusionary and boosts the power of the dominant forces in any given society. Certainly in the US, you could think about it in terms of racial capitalism. Of course, not just different axes of subordination, but the overlaps between these axes of subordination. Yeah. So the law is a very fertile ground for studying how power can be assumed in society by the elite.
So, exactly. So, when we again talk about, you also said in one of your lectures, which I think is a very interesting point, where you said there's a difference between law on paper and laws interacting with the economic realities of the world, which more often than not, law does not take into account. So, what do you think is the difference between law on paper and law in the actual world?
Right. So this goes back to the point I made about legal pluralism, right? So if you think about the law as only the words in a statute book, you're ignoring the social realities of the law. And you have to really think about what is the law. The law is puts pressure on the way people behave in society. And if you think about law in that very broad fashion, then there would be various forms of social structures that had the power of the law. So you have to, if you want to have a full accounting of the law in the formal sense, then you need to also understand how the law in other senses of the word also operate in society and how they relate to each other. in producing certain kinds of realities. And this is where, in many areas of the law, we get stuck, whether it is in relation to, say, a study of rape law or trafficking or, sex work, right? Uh, you could go to, you could go to different red light areas in India and uh, think about the ITPA, which criminalizes almost every aspect of sex work. But you find that there are bustling red light areas. So one way of arguing is to say that actually the ITPA is not implemented. But that would be a very partial picture. Some might even go so far as to say the law is irrelevant, which many social scientists often do. And that is also wrong. The reality is that the law is implemented partially. It's never implemented all the time everywhere. Um, and even when it's not implemented, the threat of its implementation redistributes bargaining powers of various stakeholders. So we need to have a very nuanced understanding of the law in the books, the law in action, how it relates to these other normative orders, whether they're social practices or whether they're market practices. What is the relationship between them? And how the threat of invoking the formal state law can then have a ripple effect across those various systems of ordering.
Yes, ma'am. When coming to sex work, actually, I think your thesis is really interesting to actually like coming back to the social realities and how law interacts with social realities. I think in your thesis, when it was relating to your work in Sonagachi, actually in Kolkata, where you studied sex work there, and one of your findings was really fascinating to me, which wherein you connected sort of the impact of rent control laws on sex work. That was very interesting because it totally elucidates our point where we say that law on ground when it reacts with economic reality is very different. So ma'am, could you please elaborate this for our listeners, as this sort of beautifully explains the impact of, I would say, seemingly gender neutral laws on female labor and also on economic realities.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the research on sex work, I think because lawyers don't necessarily do empirical work, and this is actually to make a case for lawyers to do more empirical work. So there's a vast literature on sex work. It's studied by, scholars from various disciplines. But because they're not really studying the law, either in terms of the formal state law or in terms of, this legal pluralist lens, they often miss the misunderstanding other areas of law which might have an equally powerful impact on the economic practices within sex work. So I think when I studied sex work in Sonagachi, I hadn't found any account of property laws, for that matter, in other parts of the world too. You don't really hear. The only thing that you talk about is criminalization, decriminalization, legalization, or some version of these three. And that's a very blunt kind of analysis because you're not actually looking at what are the different sets of laws that are actually in operation in a place like Sonagachi. And so while working in Sonagachi, it became very clear to me almost immediately there's something else going on. How do you explain the fact that despite the existence of the ITPA, you have such a thriving red light area? Now, one argument is to simply say because the ITPA is not enforced, but that's not entirely true because it is enforced. What actually, and you could argue that, why is it not become gentrified over time, for example? So even if you forget about the criminal law and you say, well, why is it not become gentrified, say, as in the case of Kamatipura, the question is you need a better explanation for why it is not why it is so resilient despite these forces of gentrification. And I think that's where the question of rent control became very important. And Calcutta is not unique in this. Other states also have rent control laws. And I found very quickly that uh, the status of sex workers within the sex industry depended hugely on their relationship with tenancy practices in the red light area. So they were if they had paid the salami amount and had a right to rent a property, they had a higher status compared to other sex workers in the red light area. And on the other hand, sex workers who are renting from one of these women who had paid the salami would have much less power and would aspire to have the right to rent. So what it actually shows is that within the sex industry, there is a huge variation in terms of the women who work there, and where they are in the hierarchy of sex work in that red light area also depends on their interest in property relations there. So unless you have an accounting for this, you can't actually you could think about what would happen if you change the law. So as good progressive lawyers, you may want a different kind of law. For example, you may want decriminalization in Sonagachi. But I think once I studied the rent control arrangements, it became very clear that actually decriminalization may not necessarily actually help sex workers. I actually found that irrespective of the sort of policy that would be in place in Sonagachi, the stakeholders who'd benefit the most from this would be the landlords because of the rent control practices there. So there is a real need for understanding the thick lived experience of the law, no matter what form of work you're trying to study.
Exactly. When you said that last line, exactly, that's exactly what we're saying when we say we need a female gaze in law, because it's not only, as you iterated, it's not one law that meets this case. Every other law also needs to have this case to completely work. Otherwise, the economic realities would be completely different. So I think in this regard, I think I was at the screening of the movie Working Girls in Bangalore, and I feel reproduction project is fascinating in more ways than one. So I really also like the fact that your team, along with legal research, has also meticulously perused through stories, archival information, poetry, and films to understand this complex nexus between women, law, and labor. I think also when we talk about the female gaze, it's actually a concept borrowed from the cinematic universe. So, also, this film, I would call Paramita Vora Ma'am as vivacious. This movie is a part of this project, and which I feel has beautifully portrayed women's labor in India, whether it's invisible, whether it's visible, or subject to like heavy moral judgment. Ma'am, could you please elaborate for our listeners on the significance of this film to understand women's labor in India?
Yeah, I think the film is actually a fascinating kind of initiative. And I'm
Definitely.
really glad that we were able to collaborate with Paramita on the film. So I think, first of all, I think the films are very powerful in communicating the reality around us. I mean, we could have never portrayed our research. I don't think it would reach as many people in
Right,
as effective
exactly.
a manner as the film did. But I think what the film does is to really try to show, like we do in our research, that actually various forms of women's reproductive labor are represented in the media or in popular imagination in a very particular way. As there's a process of othering that happens all the time. So when you think about surrogacy, think about a racket in Hyderabad, then you think of women who are like hidden away somewhere being forced to become surrogates. Or you see, when you think about sex work, immediately you don't need much instigation to think of, like the cages of Kamatipura, or, these kind of spectacular ways of representing women's work. I think what uh, the film does is to really, uh, stop othering the women and to present them as, as people who have lives that are not very different from yours and mine. So it's a very powerful way of trying to make what seems unfamiliar more familiar. So by the end of it, you're actually saying, well, what is the difference between, the egg donor or the surrogate, or a woman who lives two doors round down the chawl from where this woman lives, right? What exactly is the difference, or what is the difference between her and the rest of us who have small children that we're trying to bring up, right? That's the example of the surrogate in the film, who's bringing up a small child who's demanding, and she's naughty and she's playful,
Yes,
and
correct.
so on. I think it's the same thing with erotic dancing, for example. The idea that you have, women reiterating that they're not only working, but they're actually enjoying themselves. I think that's very important, because I think in a project of legal research, or even when you think about it from the lens of political economy, we think very much of rational actors, of rational
Right,
economic
exactly.
actors, whereas actually there's something about the film that brings out the quirkiness of daily life, the fun, the joy, the agency, in a way that actually is much more than just our analysis of the law or labor or economic justice, right? So there's a way in which it reaches into various other registers of women's lives. So I think, and at the same time, I think apart from rendering what is unfamiliar familiar, I think the film also shows what is rather mundane in our lives and which we take for granted and devalue, right? So the examples of the homemakers or of the domestic workers, I think we are completely familiar with these forms of work, whether it's our mothers who have raised us or it's a domestic worker who works in our home. But to just shift the lens slightly to uh, you know see how these women experience that kind of work from their perspective. We often don't hear women talking about the drudgery or the feeling of extreme exploitation that the domestic worker in the film articulates, right? So there's something about the film that opens up all of these categories and then underscores the fact that they all view themselves as working women. I think that's the most powerful part about the film, is to say that, when she asks all the women in the morning, where are you off to? They all say, we're going to
Right,
work.
exactly, correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the fundamental, that's the thesis of the project, which the film brings to life.
One instance in the film actually really enlightened me and moved me actually was the fact that when the constitution came into effect, I think you had the scene wherein we go to the brothel and the women there are very excited. The sex workers are very excited, saying that, oh, now our work is going to finally be sort of recognized as formal labor, because when we see right to occupation and sort of many other rights came in, like right to life and everything, right to equality. So I like that the film showed that there was actually a buzz in the brothels that, yes, like finally we're going to get our due. So when we look at that and when we come to the fact of analyzing sex work and the labor which goes into and how it is being portrayed in the film, we can also see the colonial undertones of what I can call the occupational criminality. Again, coming back to the previous question, ma'am. So this issue, when we come back to, I think there was a bill, I think in 2021, the Trafficking in Persons, I think Prevention, Care and Rehabilitation Bill. Um, ma'am, could you give us a sort of gendered reading of this bill and sort of contrast it with the Buddhadev Karmaskar order, which said that like there is a right to dignity irrespective of the occupation that these women perform? Uh, Ma'am, could you sort of contrast the gaze of the bill with the order? Because when we see the order, we can see the female gaze in the order. Ma'am, how would you contrast it with the bill?
Yeah, I think they both reflect kind of two, you know, uh, sort of trends in the development of the law around trafficking and sex work over the past couple of decades. So, um, and these trends kind of run parallel to each other. One is the adoption of the Palermo Protocol in 2000, after which there is so you have the 1948 UN Convention on Prostitution, and then in the wake of globalization, you have the adoption of the Palermo Protocol because it is thought to be promoting the trafficking of women across borders for sex work. And you see that the Palermo Protocol is so hugely popular. It's ratified by a very high number of states all over the world. And when it reaches sort of domestic shores in India, uh, the Indian government also feels like they have to do something about it, right? They have to change the law to adopt the essence of the Palermo Protocol. And, you know, and also there's, of course, the US government, which is ranking countries according to how they deal with trafficking. So India is very keen to not be in the tip reports kind of watch list category. So initially, the government tries to amend the ITPA because it thinks of trafficking as equivalent to sex work. Uh, but eventually, in the wake of the Nirbhaya case, there is again a push by certain groups to have a freestanding law on trafficking. And that essentially culminates in the 2021 bill. And there were many bills prior to that, but this particular bill was propelled into being by several abolitionist organizations, which really have always believed that sex work is a form of trafficking. And although the bill itself, in line with Palermo, tries to think about trafficking in terms of trafficking for sex work, trafficking for bonded labor, or trafficking for labor generally, in reality, the spirit of the bill is that it's influenced fundamentally by the ITPA. And it thinks that even voluntarily undertaken sex work essentially is trafficking. And there are many aspects of the bill which I've written about with my colleague Shavda Rajam that points to different provisions of the bill which essentially treat sex work in an exceptionist manner. Now, in contrast, Karmaskar is the culmination of, again, a very long trend of sex workers' mobilization, which started in the 90s in the wake of the HIV epidemic, where sex workers essentially were supported by the government to enforce, uh, you know, uh, prevention of HIV through the use of condoms. And one of the ways that, I mean, the only way that could be achieved was by treating women as agents who are engaging in sex work rather than as criminals or as victims. Because so the HIV prevention organizations were very much against the criminalization of sex work because it would have very perverse health outcomes. So as a result, sex workers become mobilized. And when the case comes up, which it's actually a case about a sex worker's murder in Calcutta, the court, essentially the Supreme Court takes up this case suo moto and appoints sex workers to a panel to think about. In the Karmaskar case, the Supreme Court starts off by thinking about, sex workers as victims actually of prostitution. But because sex workers groups are on the advisory committee, they slowly introduce the idea that women also do sex work voluntarily and that women who do sex work voluntarily should not be forced into rehabilitation and they have a right to live with dignity. And I think it's that voice of sex workers in the Karmaskar case that is then reflected in the order, which says that, the rights of sex workers should be upheld irrespective of the work that they do. So it's really these two very fascinating parallel trends, which have very different legal outcomes. And it's not resolved yet because the Karmaskar case, at least in relation to the legal status of sex work, has not come to a conclusion. But you can see that there are two very different visualizations of what sex work is, both in the bill and in the order.
Exactly. When we look at the order, we can see the voice of women coming through because we can see the fact that the impact and the outcome is heavily based on women's voice, which is why we see such a stark difference between a law which does not have this case and an order which does. So that was very beautifully put by you, ma'am. Correct. So now coming to sex work and its um, other dimensions. When we look at, ma'am, I think a part of the social reproduction project is also the report Dancing for Respectability. And here you say in the report, it says that there are clear continuities between sex work and erotic dancing. And you also say that many women perform both. Ma'am, could you elaborate on this idea and the impact? I think when we look at the bar, like the 2006 Mumbai High Court decision on the bar dancers case, I think it's sort of the court sort of pitted the rights of sex workers and bar dancers against each other, I think, which is sort of defeating the main solidarity aspect of feminism. Ma'am, what do you think could you elaborate of the impact of, I think, the Mumbai High Court decision on sex work?
Yeah, I mean, that's so this is really the impetus of the project of the laws of social reproduction is to really look at the continuities between these forms of work. Somebody who studies sex work may not really study erotic dancing, somebody, and vice versa, right? And the idea is this is a perfect example where the court looks at two groups of women and in the process of supporting the rights of one undermines the rights of the other when it needn't have done that. And the reality is that a lot of the women who work in all the sectors that we're looking at, whether it's sex work or dancing or paid domestic work or surrogacy, or for that matter, even being a homemaker, they often come from very similar socioeconomic backgrounds, right? So, and in all of these arenas of reproductive labor, they often enter it because of their family members. It's not unheard of in the case of sex work or dancing that, they enter it because their family members want them to, get into it. And also, if you look at what they get paid in these sectors of work, they often get paid a lot more than they would have been paid otherwise because of the stigma that it attracts. And often they will leave this form of work, but may re-enter as an intermediary. So a surrogate may become an agent for egg donors. So there are a lot of similarities in the political economy of these various forms of work, um, which is why I think it's important not to kind of treat them as all being very discrete from each other. Now, socially, they are understood differently, and even the women within these sectors view each other differently. So, although it is true that after the ban on bar dancing, several women would have been forced to do sex work. There's always a sense in which dancers would have thought, we are dancers, we are not sex workers, we're superior to sex workers. Or you see this even amongst surrogates who will say, we are not sex workers, we are not dirty women, we are actually enabling a couple to have a baby and so on. So there are ways in which, despite the similarities between these women, this is called in sociological terms, setting up boundary. It's called boundary work to say that you are actually different from another group of workers. And unfortunately, the Mumbai High Court decision played on this distinction to say that sex work was in the realm of crime and dancing in the realm of entertainment. And therefore, it could uphold the right to livelihood of dancers, but not of sex workers. So it's a very clear case in which the judges use legal categories to do boundary work, essentially.
Right.
And I've written about this to share that this was unnecessary, really, this was an unnecessary outcome. But this is how the law produces certain categories around women's work and entrenches divisions amongst women.
In this, actually, I also read extensively about what, like when the ban happened, I mean, the ban on the bar dancers case, I think it was the Maharashtra Police Act which they sort of amended and then sort of brought this ban. There was a lot of economic precarity that sort of creeped in. And like we saw, like it happened in this case, and then it was a very like different time for them, wherein they sort of faced this economic hardship as to what to do now, or if the licensing procedures were sort of heavy on them, they would be like, okay, we are now it's worrying for us that we might have to look at newer avenues of work. And as you also said, that some of them might have been forced to like sort of take up sex work. So ma'am, looking at this economic precarity, I think in the movie and I think in the film we also saw how you covered the Adal Padal dancers and the Karagatam dancers, I think in the state of Tamil Nadu. Ma'am, how do you think, when we talk about economic precarity, how can the state sort of anticipate and cushion such persons? As you say, Adal Padal dancers like sort of earn very less even now. And like, ma'am, what do you think would have been the impact of economic shocks on them, like demonetization and the pandemic, where we saw widespread hardships on such persons? Ma'am, what do you think the state can do to sort of cushion them?
Yeah, I think we have to just basically understand that, a very large percentage of the Indian working population is in the informal economy. So I don't think the circumstances of sex workers or dancers is very different from, migrant male workers in working in big cities. And there is actually a lot of interesting literature on, the precarity that workers face. So I actually don't think it's very difficult to anticipate some of the consequences of, economic shocks on these workers. Now, there are some who would use the occasion to further their political agendas. So certainly in the case of the pandemic, in the early months of the pandemic, there was a study that said that red light areas were the places through which COVID was being spread, and therefore we should shut down the red light area. So, so there are people who will think about the economic shock as an opportunity to actually achieve, their goals. But if you're interested in, uh, you know, strengthening the rights of these workers, I think it's not very difficult to look at the literature that is out there. And many researchers have looked at various forms of informality and what, these economic shocks can do to them. But of course, there's also opportunities here, right? Certainly with COVID, a lot of sex workers, started engaging in, virtual sex work. So there are ways in which the economic shocks produce a lot of precarity, but they also became occasion for restructuring within the sector. There was also a sense, I remember early in the pandemic, that people thought that domestic workers who lost their jobs would not be able to come back in so easily, that a lot of this domestic work would be insourced, that actually there'd be fewer jobs for them. So this is all it's an empirical question that we need to kind of analyze and learn from. And actually the pandemic was very interesting because it was also an occasion to further the rights of certain groups. So in the case of sex workers, for example, the Karmaskar case was uh, you know, uh, invoked in order to have ration cards issued to sex workers without proof of ID or their residence. So uh, these are occasions for quite important changes. And in the case of sex workers, the effects of criminalization were sought to be reversed by making an exception administratively so that sex workers could actually access rations without showing proof of address, which, the ITPA makes very difficult for them to have proper tenancy arrangements. So I think there is, but you cannot actually analyze the unintended consequences unless you have a baseline knowledge of how these sectors work, right? And that's why one needs to look at it from the lens of political economy rather than just crime, because that doesn't take you very far in trying to pass out how sex workers work, or for that matter, how workers in the gig economy work, or how, migrants in slums, urban slums live, right? So I think you need to have a very dispassionate and very thorough and rigorous understanding of the political economy, and then also an equally dispassionate understanding of what shifts in both the law and economic circumstances can have, the impact they can have on these workers. And you can't always assume that one thing is entirely bad or one thing is entirely good. You have to suspend judgment until you actually work out in an analytical fashion the consequences of those shifts.
Right, exactly. So when you look at again the order, which we say again, we go back to it, that possessing the female gaze, we also see that the fact that when you mentioned that, I think sex workers were again sort of looked at as a breeding ground for COVID. I think in the movie, to contrast it, I think history is repeating, because I think the British again blame sex workers for spreading venereal diseases. I think it's a sort of like repeat of history, which I think I sort of connected with the movie, which sort of was very interesting. And looking at this, like when you also said the other paddle dancers and their precarity and how it's the state, it's not very difficult for the state to see. But right now we see that the state is usually taking sort of understanding that banning everything is sort of necessary. I think there is a common notion with the scholars that I think sort of like ascribing neo-criminality with what I can say to surrogacy further pushes them underground and into the dark recesses that they say of the market. So, ma'am, what do you think is a better approach when it comes to regulation versus regulatory bans? And I think this regulatory ban has also led to this concept of altruistic surrogacy, when the relation of the like sort of the parents should sort of take it up without any, like, free of cost, like altruistic, like that I just want to do it for them. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, in the case of surrogacy, I think the idea is that, women are being exploited and being coerced into becoming surrogates. Actually, anybody who reads the very rich ethnographies of surrogacy in the Indian context, many ethnographers have written books about how surrogacy actually worked at the time that it was legal. I mean, there are high levels of exploitation, no doubt about it, but you also find that women are not just passive victims. And surrogacy by itself is a highly medically mediated procedure that actually you can't force someone into. You can't just, because they are actually, having a baby. So it's not, I mean, there are lots of assumptions made about criminal networks and organized crime in relation to surrogacy, which are simply not borne out when you look at it. That's not to say there is no exploitation. There was, women were kept in surrogacy hostels. They, had compulsory cesarean sections and so on. But I think the lawmakers also failed to see the high levels of inequality in society which drove women into those forms of labor. And the fact that women, for the education that they had, earned a lot more through surrogacy than they would have ever had through any other form of work. So there were women who used to be domestic workers who ran shops and so on, and they earned a lot more through surrogacy. Again, it doesn't mean that that was a magic bullet to all their economic problems, because the amount that they earned was roughly enough only to pay for their kids' education or to have a home. Right. But the recognition is that, we need to recognize women as economic agents, and as households having basic needs such as, decent homes, right? If the state provided decent homes, or access to decent homes, then maybe women wouldn't be doing this kind of work. So there is a whole structural backdrop which one always needs to remember. And you have to think about women as economic actors. And there are many films actually, even on surrogacy, that show that women chose, even where their husbands didn't want them to do surrogacy, they chose to perform surrogacy because they wanted to ensure the economic well being of their families. So when you don't recognize women's economic agency, um, in a country like India, where there is a very high levels of inequality and there is a need, I mean, it's fundamentally is a question of supply and demand, where there is a need, where there are many infertile couples and there is a need for either egg donation or surrogacy. And then you have a lot of women who actually don't have suitable means of income, partly because you haven't dealt with their basic needs as citizens, or you haven't actually improved their rights as workers. So, if these surrogates used to be domestic workers, if they are not getting paid minimum wages, right, they will feel compelled to take on other forms of work. So, if you're not willing to address all of these issues of inequality, then the mismatch between the supply and demand will mean that you have an underground market that actually puts women at greater disadvantages than all the other stakeholders in these sectors. So, I mean, it's very clear that I think bans of any sort in the context of India don't work. And I don't think surrogacy and egg donation is an exception in that sense.
Ma'am, as you previously mentioned that there are other factors that sort of interact uh, with the economic realities of women and them becoming agents. So I think in the film, I remember there was a stark visualization of the place where she lived before and the place she lived after the economic boom that she faced in her life because of becoming this person who became an economic agent, right? In while doing the work of surrogacy. So I think that's very interesting that you said the housing conditions also sort of interact with the fact that there are many layers of inequality in India. Coming to a new sort of emergence of a sort of neo exploitation, we might say in the recent scenario that we see the widespread emergence of neo models of exploitation. That's what I've looked at. Like they're carefully, sort of the state is carefully couching women's labor as honorary and voluntary, earning them community honors, but not adequate wages and labor protection. I am specifically speaking about this class of workers called the ASHA workers, the Anganwadi teachers, and the midday meal cooks. So, ma'am, I think in one of your lectures, you had also spoken about the concept of death cycle that the workers fall into. Ma'am, in the light of the precarious situation of ASHA workers without labor protections, could you please elaborate on this for our listeners, and why do you think this can be sort of considered as a new form of bonded labor?
So I'll just be very careful about, I think that in and of itself is not evil. We all have various kinds of debt. And I would also be hesitant to call it bonded labor because bonded labor has a very specific definition under Indian law. And the consequences of calling it bonded labor under a regime of, carceral sort of impulses could have very bad consequences for anyone considered to be a bonded laborer. So I wouldn't think of these women as bonded laborers, but I do think that there is a problem with debt. I think there's debt in India, especially incurred by women, is a pervasive problem. So we've seen this in a lot of work that we've done in several states where women are has some debt through SHGs, but often self-help groups, but they often have a lot of debt from microfinance institutions. And invariably, they're taking debt because they don't have formal documentation to get loans from banks. If they take loans from SHGs, it's not quite enough for their purposes. Even when they do, they present themselves as taking a loan for livelihoods, whereas in fact, they're taking it for consumption. and for very basic forms of consumption. Like I said before, the consumption in terms of housing, in terms of education, in terms of health crises. So women are always one loan away from penury, right? Uh, so there is a pervasive problem of indebtedness that we found, especially in rural parts of India, and I think it certainly doesn't help that, first of all, women don't have access to the job market because of our low female labor force participation rates, and where they do have work, the work is often related to the kind, it's seen as an extension of the unpaid work that they do within the home. So ASHAs and Anganwadi workers and paid domestic workers, they're all perfect examples of this, where we simply assume that they do this work at home. Women perform this kind of work at home without pay. So, so therefore it's not real work. And therefore, there are no boundaries to the kinds of work that they do in that job specification. So, whether you're doing paid domestic work in an individual household or you're an ASHA worker working for the government, there are actually no boundaries to the tasks that you perform and adequate pay for that form of work. So, it's considered to be voluntary work, or it's just considered to be an extension of unpaid work. So, it's not viewed as paid work, where one should have minimum wages, where one should have suitable working conditions, where you have all the protections of labor laws. So when you don't have decent work or decent work protections, then it's natural that you have to either work more jobs in order to make the same amount of money, right? So it's not unheard of. Whether it's men or women, you will see security guards who are migrant laborers in the big cities often working 24/7. They're working 2 12-hour shifts in order to make a living. And that's true of women. They may do, they may be a nurse, they may be a child carer, then they become a janitor in a hospital, then they work in housekeeping somewhere else in an office. So it's a vicious cycle where, because they're not paid adequately, they have to either take up more poorly paid work, or or have to incur debt in order to simply take care of themselves. So I think one of the key insights of our project is to not just think of reproductive labor from our perspective, right? Because typically we understand paid domestic work in terms of, oh, somebody comes home and, how do we treat that work? But you have to think about it in terms of whether the workers are able to reproduce themselves. Once you reverse the way that you ask the questions, then you're asking, why are they doing certain things? It's because they're not able to meet their own needs for reproduction, which is to have a roof over their heads, to have a decent income stream, to, have children who are able to go to good schools, so are healthy, and, are able to take care of their basic needs. So I think if you think about it from that perspective, then it becomes very clear that it's not very useful to call these people bonded laborers. Rather, we have to think about how we can ensure decent work for, both men and women in this context.
Exactly. So I think in the film also there was a part where uh, the team also interviewed ASHA workers while they were on protest. So I think that was very interesting to see that how um, they spoke about their work being endless, because after they finish the work of the day, they're supposed to go back home. And when they have to do labor for their houses, they're instead doing the labor for their house as well as writing diaries, these extensive diaries. I think as a part of this female gaze project, I also sort of had the occasion to interview several of the ASHA workers, and they had the same complaint that the diaries, sometimes the diary writing that they sort of do stretches the entire day, and then they're sort of filling these diaries. So, ma'am, what do you think is the, like, as you also again, so you also said that this is sort of viewed as an extension of women's work, which is sort of like historically undervalued. Ma'am, what do you think is the next course that we ought to take? Because as we see the workers' demand, when you see we need to shift the perspective on how these workers are sort of grappling with the problems. What do you think is the next step? Like, do you think regularization is the natural next step?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the case, it's a scandal that, workers who are performing very core functions of the state in terms of health and education are themselves not being treated as employees, right? So the first step is to simply make them employees. And I think there are some interesting uh, judgments, like the Moneyburn case, that says very clearly that there is a right to education that's guaranteed under Indian law, and there's a right to food security. And ASHA and Anganwadi workers are basically delivering on both of those promises of the state. So we have a right to care from the state, which is realizable because of the efforts of ASHAs and Anganwadi workers. And so given that they're performing this very crucial public work, that they should be treated as employees, and hiding behind labor laws which are uh, were drafted historically for the factory floor is not actually very productive. We need to have creative interpretations of these laws to recognize the reproductive labor that women are performing for pay, and to treat them as workers and give them all the benefits of labor laws. And of course, the response is always that this will produce a fiscal burden for the state. But that's not good enough, right? Because these are workers. And you could very clearly argue that if, in fact, they are getting paid less than the minimum wage, then they are being subject to forced labor, which is illegal under the Indian Constitution. So there's a lot of room for creative lawyers to actually make the case for treating these forms of work as decent work.
Right. As an extension, I think, to like when we look at unpaid labor and the care work performed, as like they also have a right to care, and the care work that they perform like continually, like I'm talking about the homemakers. Like I think they are sort of the back, like if we visualize it, I think they're sort of the backbone of the economy. But until recently, their contributions were not even calculated as per like GDP. I don't know if it still is, but I think there were several sort of proposals, I think, with the government that they want to start doing this, but I don't know what happened to that. But again, when we look at ASHA workers, it's sort of they're termed as these selfless social volunteers who are sort of doing this cause for the public good. I think this same situation, I think this is the same sort of couching of the language for homemakers, where they looked at these selfless workers who, and this service can never be monetized. So when we see that these women are 24/7 working without leaves and any other benefits, and also like looking at this homemaker wage debate, which I think many of the feminists have contributed to this debate, and there's a lot of criticism when it comes to in sort of institutionalizing their role, or sort of saying that homemakers need to be paid by their husbands. So I think many feminists have sort of argued that this will sort of cause a lot of exploitation in the familial setup, because it's sort of institutionalizing their role. If I'm not wrong, I think even the Kamal Hassan's party sort of had this election campaign that homemakers would be paid. And there was also a proposal, if I'm not wrong, I think by the Congress government long ago, that they wanted to institutionalize and make the husbands pay the homemakers. So I think like when I looked at this debate, I sort of felt that it was a little misguided, again, as many feminists pointed out. And my focus, ma'am, has been on a sort of conceptualizing a social security pension scheme for women, because like I could see that I think there's a lot of research and survey on this, that I think 70% of the homemakers in their old age are left sort of homeless, and they do not have any income for them to like sort of sustain. And ma'am, do you think such a pension scheme can be conceived by the state? Also, I do understand that any pension scheme has to, it will only work if there's a contribution from the workers as well. So, ma'am, do you think such a scheme can be conceived? And do you think it would work in India?
Yeah, I mean, there's no, absolutely, it's a good idea. Many Latin American countries have done it. So there's no reason why we can't do it, and we should do it. I think we just have to think about the range of options that are on the table. I think feminists have a problem when there are cash transfers being given to women, but actually will, on the same account, argue for, matrimonial property. Or a community of property for women who, at the point of divorce, to say that there should be recognition, economic recognition of their unpaid work, because often at the point of divorce, women are worse off than they used to be when they were married. So I think we have to think very carefully about a range of these options. Of course, also the proposal that, they have control over the husband's income. I mean, there are lots of different innovative ideas. But I think the reality is that women in India, a very large percentage of women are married.
Right.
And when they are married, and a large percentage of them do not have access to paid work. And so, in effect, the lack of any kind of economic bargaining power has ripple effects on other forms of bargaining power, whether it's political or social or personal or sexual for that matter. So I think we have to put money in the hands of women, and how most effectively do you do that is up for debate. But I think also things like cash transfers, we've done a lot of work on cash transfers, and we've not found any evidence that shows that it leads to increased demands for unpaid work from women. So, whatever assumptions we have, we need to test empirically to see what effects it's having on the ground. And if anything, it's actually giving women some dignity. And it's only by economic recognition of women's unpaid work that you can then begin to think about redistributing unpaid work, and all the other kind of ideas around SDG 5.4, which the middle class is very committed to. I don't think you can redistribute unpaid work unless you recognize it to begin with. So I think in that sense, the cash transfers make sense. And you don't have to wait till you get old or you're divorced in order to get your unpaid work recognized. That's the other benefit of the cash transfers, that it covers women during their adult years. Um, so I think the short answer is yes. If the state is committed politically to a solution, it can find a way to work it out.
Right. Everything boils down to like political will. Correct. So, yes. So, ma'am, since the main vision of your project, the loss of social reproduction, was to examine the interconnections between these five sectors, which we have extensively spoken about, that is sex work, erotic dancing, paid domestic work, unpaid domestic and care work, and finally surrogacy. Ma'am, can you share share your findings with our listeners, like in relation to these interconnections specifically?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interconnections, and it's actually difficult to
Right.
present the findings within a short period of time. But I think one thing is very clear, that actually there's a lot of similarities. I mean, the intuitions we started out with have been confirmed, that there is a lot of similarity across these forms of work. That, in fact, I think more and more of these forms of work are subject to criminal law regulation or to bans. Even since we started the project, when we started the project, there were only proposals to on egg donation and surrogacy, for instance. But towards the conclusion of the project, we already had these laws which, effectively only allow altruistic egg donation and surrogacy. So there's a way in which there are very highly carceral moves being made in relation to women's work. And we think that if we think of all these forms of work as just different versions of women's reproductive labor, that no form of work should be treated exceptionally. In other words, sex work, erotic dancing, or surrogacy are not exceptional when compared to paid domestic work or unpaid work. Therefore, there should be no criminal regulation of these forms of work, because that really disempowers women tremendously. It does much more harm than good. So I think we have to stop criminalizing these forms of work. And when it comes to forms of work that we are more comfortable with because they're familiar and familial, we need to think of them as decent work. What would make them decent work? Uh, how can you recognize economically recognize unpaid work? And how can you make paid domestic work or paid care work decent? I think these are the ways that we have to think about it. I think, and of course, the project set out to build solidarity between these different groups of women. And we found that this was a very, very difficult. It was an uphill struggle, because the groups of the unions that work, because there's very different levels of mobilization amongst them. And even where they do come to the same table, right, to have a discussion, there are still some very strong views about certain forms of work that the unions are not able to overcome. So actually, although we were hopeful that there would be more solidarity between these forms of work and between workers, we found that actually it's been an uphill struggle. So I think the next step would be, we hope that uh, by decriminalizing, by destigmatizing certain forms of work, that actually those women can mobilize better. And once they mobilize better, then they can forge these solidarities more effectively.
That's a very interesting finding, because as we, like, most of the feminists have always tried to sort of integrate women into this one sort of like the bracket of solidarity, I would call it. And it's quite different, because like there are intersectionalities that we sort of have to keep in mind. So ma'am, like, as we saw what a female gaze can do to a law and how can it sort of interact with the economic realities better in the Buddhadev Karmaskar order. Um, Ma'am, now that we have a sort of broad consensus as to what the female gaze can do in lawmaking, as to centering their voices into these neutral laws can sort of help us. So, ma'am, do you think constituting a sort of female gaze standing committee at the parliamentary level to sort of vet all the laws and sort of bring in this perspective which is missing, to center women's perspectives and sort of recommend changes to the laws, be it neutral or gendered? What do you think will be the effect of having such a committee at the parliamentary level?
I mean, it's hard to tell what the effect will be, but I do think, I mean, it's per se not a bad idea, but I do think we need to remember that, this is somewhat like the debate over female judges. Just because you have women who are judges doesn't mean that they reflect the views of all women. And I think that's another finding of the project, that there is that actually it's not just a question of intersectionality. It's just that women can have widely differentiated stakes, uh, economically, legally, socially. So we can't assume that there is any one women's perspective. If anything, I think we see that on many issues, there are elite feminists who have certain ideas, and then there are the working class women who have different ideas about, certainly in the realm of labor. So I think while the idea of a committee that does like a gender audit of every law is not a bad idea, I think we can't assume that just because there would be women on the committee that in fact, um, you know, uh, it would serve the interests of all women. I think we'd have to do something slightly more thoughtful, around it. I mean, and there are parallels in other disciplines, like I think in the area of economics. I mean, there's gender budgeting and so on.
Right.
And while it might be a very interesting idea, we can already see that there's a lot of criticism from feminists of how the idea of gender budgeting has been appropriated by the state. So, not only do we have to be skeptical of whether it reflects the experiences of women in all its complexity, we also have to be aware of the fact that it could be co-opted and have some, it could become a tick the box exercise. And given where feminism is at, at the current moment, there's a very high likelihood of this kind of co-optation.
I'm coming to my last and favorite question. This question is very close to my heart, and so here goes. I read this book written by Begum Rokeya Shekhawat Hussain, which is basically touted as the first self-conscious feminist utopian story, which is written in English by an Indian woman. Now, to tell a bit about this beautiful story, this person, Sultana, dreams of a society which is filled with flowers, scientific progress, and happiness. A world which sees a sort of gender reversal, a sort of gender role reversal. And it is quite interesting to me that this world is incidentally also a world without war, crime, excessive usage of fossil fuels, and many of the social evils that plague our society today. Ma'am, this is Sultana's dream, but I just wanted to ask, what is your dream for the world? Because I understand dreaming is a radical and political act in itself. So, ma'am, what is your dream for the world?
This would be very difficult to answer, but I do think that, I think certainly I believe that women should have access to economic resources, first and foremost, more than anything else. And if one were to prioritize what we need most access to, I think that's what I would think of, economic security, as well as leisure. I think, given that we are at the end of a long-term project on social reproduction, we found no matter where we go, it's been impossible even talking to women because they are working all the time.
Right, exactly.
And I think while we are very interested in work and decent work and workers' rights, we also think women have a right to leisure. So if there can be economic security and some semblance of leisure, I think that would be good enough for me.
That's very nice. Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking out the time. This was, we really had a very insightful discussion, I'm sure, and our listeners would definitely appreciate this. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. As we close this episode, we return to our reflections on the female gaze, considering what still remains to be unpacked. While we have explored its presence in lawmaking, the concept itself, drawn from the cinematic universe, is far from being fully understood. What emerges, dear listeners, however, is the need to discuss a powerful idea. The female gaze as a sum total of women's lived experiences and collective consciousness. Through our conversation with a filmmaker, we begin to understand what it truly means to center the margins of society, such as women. We reflect on how to recognize women's perspectives, their experiences, their sense of leisure, their worldview, and what brings them joy. To engage with the female gaze is to step into their world, in their sorrows, their lives, their realities, and their never-ending labor. It is through this that we begin to understand not just what shapes women's identities, but to look at women as human. We also break down women's labor, discussing the Working Girls documentary and how it invites us to see women's labor that has long been stigmatized and morally ostracized in a new light. Stay tuned for more.